Curtis Montague was a man who moved markets with a single phone call. He had the kind of wealth that didn't just buy things. It bought silence, respect, and a seat at the world's most exclusive tables. On the surface, his life was a masterpiece of old-world luxury and pinstriped perfection. But behind the cold, athletic exterior of the city's most feared CEO, there was a ghost. A void that no amount of gold leaf molding or billion-dollar acquisitions could fill. Exactly 24 months ago, his world had split in two. His wife, Joanna, hadn't just left him. She had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a cold divorce and a silence that had lasted 730 days. Curtis told himself he had moved on. He had the empire, and he had Rita, radiant in red, by his side tonight at the grand gala. But the universe was about to prove that secrets don't stay buried, and some ghosts come back wearing a maid's uniform. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp wool, a place where the air itself smelled of expensive cologne and vintage champagne. Curtis Montague stood at the center of it all, the undisputed sun around which the city's financial elite orbited. His navy pinstripe suit was tailored to a degree of lethal precision, hugging his athletic frame in a way that commanded space without him saying a single word. He checked his silver luxury watch, a masterpiece of mechanical engineering that cost more than most people earned in a decade, and offered a thin, practiced smile to the senator standing before him. Beside him, Rita was aflame in the middle of a winter palace. Her form-fitting red dress, with its daring keyhole neckline, drew every eye in the room, acting as the perfect accessory to Curtis's cold, calculated power. She leaned in, her sleek box braids grazing the shoulder of his jacket, and whispered a biting observation about a rival's declining stock. Curtis chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. This was the life he had built from the wreckage of his past. A world of high-velocity deals and status-conscious companionship where every move was a power play. "You're distracted tonight, Curtis," Rita noted, her voice smooth but carrying a hint of a needle. She adjusted the lapel of his suit, her eyes tracking the way he looked toward the grand entrance every few minutes. "The merger is signed. The room is yours. What else is there to look for?" "Efficiency, Rita." "I'm looking for efficiency," Curtis replied, though the lie tasted like ash. In truth, the opulence of the gala of gold felt like a gilded cage. He had spent the last 2 years filling his life with these noise-filled rooms to drown out the silence of his empty penthouse. He was a man who prided himself on control, yet tonight, a strange prickling sensation crawled up the back of his neck. He watched the waitstaff and cleaners move like ghosts along the periphery of the room, invisible to the titans of industry who sipped their drinks. They were the machinery that kept this world running, ignored and nameless. Rita laughed at something the senator said, her hand resting possessively on Curtis's arm. She was the perfect partner for a man of his stature, observant, ambitious, and utterly focused on the climb. As they moved toward a private table near the marble pillars, Curtis felt the full weight of his empire. He was the CEO of Stone Capital. He had erased his weaknesses and buried his regrets under mountains of profit. He was untouchable. Or so he told himself, right up until the moment a tray rattled nearby, and the carefully polished veneer of his life began to crack. The private table near the marble pillars was an island of supposed tranquility, but for Curtis, the air had grown inexplicably heavy. He pulled out the heavy velvet chair for Rita, his movements as fluid and robotic as a man who had performed this ritual 1,000 times. Rita sat, the vibrant red of her dress spilling over the seat like a warning sign, her eyes already scanning the room for the next person worth impressing. Curtis sat opposite her, the silver watch on his wrist catching the overhead light of the massive crystal chandeliers, ticking away the seconds of a night he suddenly wanted to end. "I think we should discuss the sterling acquisition tomorrow morning," Rita said, her voice cutting through the ambient hum of jazz and clinking crystal. She didn't wait for him to respond before signaling to a passing waiter. "And we'll need another bottle of the 2012 vintage. This one is breathing a bit too much." Curtis nodded absently, his mind miles away, anchored in a memory from 24 months ago that he usually kept under lock and key. He was so deep in the fog of the past that he didn't notice the server approaching from his left. She was carrying a heavy tray of crystal stemware, her steps slow and labored. As she reached the edge of their table, a boisterous guest at the adjacent table laughed suddenly, throwing his arm back in a wide, careless gesture. It happened in slow motion. The guest's elbow clipped the edge of the silver tray. The stemware wobbled, a frantic dance of glass on metal, before 3 flutes of champagne tipped over. The liquid splashed across the polished marble table, a golden tide that rushed toward Curtis's navy pinstripe sleeve and Rita's silk lap. Rita let out a sharp, indignant gasp, pulling back so quickly her chair scraped harshly against the floor. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" she snapped, her somber expression hardening into one of pure elitist irritation. "Look at this mess. My dress is nearly ruined." The server stood frozen for a split second, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to vibrate off her skin. She didn't apologize immediately, not out of rudeness but because she seemed to be struggling just to keep her balance. Curtis felt a surge of his usual corporate impatience rising in his throat. He was a man who demanded perfection, and this was an unacceptable lapse in service. "Service," Rita called out, her voice loud enough to draw the eyes of the surrounding guests. She looked at the server with a cold, observant disdain. "Don't just stand there. Clean this up. Now." Curtis turned his head, ready to deliver a sharp reprimand that would likely cost the woman her job. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died before they could reach his lips. The server had placed her tray down on a side stand and was now reaching for a white cleaning cloth. As she leaned over the table to blot the spill, Curtis saw the beads of sweat standing out on her forehead, shimmering like tiny diamonds under the gala lights. He saw the way her white maid's uniform, with its stark black piping, strained against a midsection that was heavy and round with advanced pregnancy. She was hunched over the marble, supporting her weight with one trembling hand while the other worked the cloth. She didn't look up. Her eyes were downcast, focused entirely on the task of erasing the mess she had partially caused. Curtis felt a strange, cold shiver race down his spine. There was something about the curve of her neck, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, that felt like a physical blow to his chest. "Is there a problem?" Rita hissed, noticing Curtis's sudden silence. Curtis couldn't answer. He was staring at the server's hand. It was a hand he had held in the dark. A hand that had once worn a diamond ring, he had picked out with the same precision he used for his business deals. The room began to spin, the gold leaf moldings and crystal lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of wealth that suddenly felt suffocating. He leaned forward, his athletic frame rigid, his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for the woman to lift her head. "Joanna," he whispered, the name barely more than a breath, yet it felt like a gunshot in the quiet space between them. The gala's ambient noise, the clinking of silver, the polite laughter of billionaires, the distant swell of the orchestra, seemed to vanish into a vacuum, leaving Curtis in a world of absolute terrifying silence. He remained frozen in his chair, his eyes locked on the woman in the white maid's uniform. She didn't look up at the sound of her name. Instead, she continued to scrub the marble with a mechanical, desperate intensity, her knuckles white as she gripped the cleaning cloth. Every detail of her presence began to assault his senses with the force of a physical wrecking ball. He saw the way the white fabric of her sleeve was damp with sweat, clinging to an arm that had grown thinner than he remembered. He saw the black piping of her collar, a stark contrast against her skin, and the way her breathing came in shallow, ragged hitches. But it was the belly, the heavy, unmistakable curve of her pregnancy pressing against the edge of the table, that made the world tilt on its axis. Curtis's hand, still resting on the table near his wine glass, began to shake. The silver watch on his wrist, a symbol of his mastery over time and his environment, felt like a lead weight. He had spent 2 years telling himself that Joanna was a closed chapter, a woman who had simply tired of his world and retreated into a life he didn't care to track. He had imagined her in a quiet suburb, perhaps teaching or traveling, living off the settlement he had coldly calculated for her. He had never, in his darkest nightmares, imagined her like this, hunched over, serving the very people he called his peers, carrying a child in a room filled with people who wouldn't even look her in the eye. "Curtis!" Rita's voice was sharp now, a jagged blade of suspicion. She was looking at him, then at the worker, her sleek box braids swaying as she narrowed her eyes. "Why did you call her that? Who is this woman?" The worker finally paused. Her hand stopped its rhythmic scrubbing. For a moment she remained bowed, her head hanging low, her hair shielding her face from the light of the chandeliers. Then with a slow, agonizing effort that seemed to cost her every ounce of strength she possessed, she began to straighten her back. She used the table to hoist herself up, her hand pressing into the cold marble for leverage. As she rose, the physical toll of her labor became even more apparent. Her face was flushed, beads of perspiration rolling down her temples and disappearing into the collar of her uniform. When she finally lifted her eyes to meet his, there was no recognition in them. There was no warmth, no anger, not even the spark of a shared memory. There was only a hollow professional void. "I apologize for the mess, sir," she said. Her voice was thin, raspy with exhaustion, yet it carried the undeniable ghost of the melody that had once filled his home. "I'll have a fresh cloth and more sanitizer here in a moment." Curtis felt a roar in his ears. The way she said sir was like a slap across the face. It was a word meant to build a wall, a verbal badge of her current status as a servant and his as a master. He wanted to reach out, to grab her arm and demand to know how this had happened, but his body felt as though it had been turned to stone. "Joanna, stop this," he managed to choke out, his voice cracking, a sound utterly foreign to the man who commanded boardrooms. "Look at me. It's Curtis. What are you doing here? And the baby?" His gaze dropped back to her stomach, and for the first time, a flicker of something crossed Joanna's face. It wasn't love. It was a raw, primal flicker of fear, followed immediately by a hardening of her expression into a mask of ice. She tucked the soiled cloth into the pocket of her apron and took a half-step back, her eyes remaining fixed on a point just above his shoulder. "I think you have me confused with someone else, sir," she said, her voice steadying into a chillingly polite drone. "I am just the server for this section. If you have a complaint about the spill, I can call the floor manager for you." Rita let out a short, mocking laugh, though her eyes remained predatory. "Curtis, really? You're making a scene over a maid. She clearly doesn't know you. Sit down before people start to stare." But Curtis couldn't sit down. The old-world decor, the gold leaf moldings, and the massive crystal chandeliers above felt as though they were closing in on him, a mountain of gold intended to crush the truth. He looked at the woman in white, his wife, his Joanna, and realized that while he had been busy building an empire of glass and steel, she had been surviving in a world of sweat and marble. And the silence between them was no longer a mystery. It was a weapon. The air in the ballroom had grown thin, vibrating with the silent frequency of a disaster about to break. Curtis stood up, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like a serrated blade. He ignored the eyes of the nearby diners, ignored the senator's curious glance, and ignored the tightening of Rita's hand on his sleeve. His entire universe had shrunk to the woman standing 3 feet away, the woman whose scent had once been lavender and expensive cream, but was now the sharp, acidic tang of industrial cleaner and the salt of honest, exhausting sweat. "Joanna," he said, his voice dropping an octave, thick with a desperation that threatened to shatter his polished exterior. "Stop. Look at me. Truly look at me." For a heartbeat, the professional mask wavered. Joanna's eyes, those deep, familiar pools that had once held all his secrets, flickered toward his. In that brief second, the void of the last 2 years collapsed. He saw the girl who had stayed up with him until dawn when he was just a middle manager with a dream. He saw the woman who had cried when they bought their first home. But the warmth was gone, replaced by a searing, silent accusation. She looked at his navy pinstriped suit, his silver watch, and his pristine, uncalloused hands. To her, he wasn't a husband anymore. He was a monument to the system that was currently breaking her back. Joanna's hand went instinctively to her stomach, a protective maternal gesture that felt like a punch to Curtis's gut. The curve was so prominent now, her child, their child, resting heavily against her spine. He could see the strain in her posture, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other to ease the ache of standing for hours on end. "You are mistaken, Mr. Montague," she said, her voice dropping the sir for the first time, replaced by the lethal formality of his surname. "I am the staff tonight. My name is on the roster as employee 402. That is the only identity I have in this room." Rita stood up then, her vibrant red dress a jarring contrast to Joanna's stark white uniform. She stepped into the space between them, her box braids swaying with the sharp movement of her head. She looked Joanna up and down, her somber expression twisting into something predatory and territorial. "Employee 402, Rita repeated, her voice dripping with a calculated, cold poison. "If you are the staff, then act like it. You've spilled wine on a $3,000 silk dress, and now you're harassing my partner with some delusional story about a past life. Curtis, look at her. She's a servant. She's a maid. Whatever you think you see is a trick of the light." Joanna didn't flinch. She stood her ground, even as a fresh bead of sweat rolled down her temple. She looked at Rita, not with anger, but with a profound, weary pity that seemed to infuriate the other woman even more. "The mess is being handled, ma'am," Joanna said quietly. "I will bring the fresh linens." "You'll bring your supervisor," Rita snapped. "I want a formal report. This kind of incompetence shouldn't be allowed at a gala of this caliber." Curtis felt a roar of protectiveness surge through him, a ghost of the man he used to be. "Rita, enough. Be quiet." The table went silent. The surrounding guests began to whisper, their eyes darting between the billionaire in the pinstriped suit, the socialite in red, and the pregnant maid who looked ready to collapse. Curtis reached out, his hand hovering inches from Joanna's shoulder, wanting to bridge the distance but afraid that touching her would make the nightmare, or the reality, more real. "Joanna," he whispered, his eyes searching hers for a crack, a sign, anything. "Where have you been? Why are you doing this? I gave you everything in the settlement. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be working like this." Joanna finally let a small bitter smile touch her lips. It was a cold, jagged thing. "You gave me money, Curtis. You gave me a check to make the inconvenience of our marriage go away so you could focus on your pinstripes and your boardrooms. You didn't give me a home. You didn't give me a family." She turned away, her movements slow and heavy as she reached for her tray. Her eyes were downcast again, the familiar light extinguished by the reality of the marble floor she still had to clean. "I have work to do," she said, her voice becoming a drone once more. "Please excuse me." As she walked away, her gait slightly uneven from the weight of her pregnancy, Curtis stood among the gold leaf moldings and crystal chandeliers, feeling the full, crushing weight of the empire he had built. He realized then that the ghost in his penthouse hadn't been Joanna. It had been his own soul, and he had just found it scrubbing floors in the dark. Curtis stood rooted to the spot, his surroundings dissolving into a blur of gold and white. The music, the clinking of silver, and the murmur of 100 conversations became a dull underwater roar. His mind was a chaotic storm, trapped in a single staggering realization that made the 2 years of his carefully constructed life feel like a house of cards. The pregnancy, the way Joanna had held her stomach, not "Curtis, sit down. You're making us a spectacle." Rita's voice sliced through his paralysis. She was standing beside him, her fingers digging into the muscle of his arm with a strength that betrayed her growing desperation. To Rita, the world was a stage where the only sin was losing one's poise. "Whatever history you think you have with that girl, it's over. Look at the people watching. Look at the senator." Curtis turned his head slowly, looking at Rita as if she were a stranger speaking a language he no longer understood. The vibrant red of her dress, which he had found so alluring only an hour ago, now looked like a bloodstain against the purity of his sudden, agonizing clarity. He looked at her perfectly styled box braids and her somber, calculating eyes, and for the first time, he saw the hollowness of the life he had chosen. Everything was a transaction. Everything was for show. "The baby," Curtis whispered, his voice thick and unrecognizable. "She's pregnant, Rita. And what is that to you?" Rita hissed, her eyes darting to ensure no one was close enough to overhear. "People like that get pregnant every day, Curtis. They live lives of consequence-free accidents. It has nothing to do with us. It has nothing to do with you." The word accident triggered a silent explosion in Curtis's mind. He remembered Joanna's face, the exhaustion, the sweat, and the fierce, quiet pride in the way she had looked at him. That wasn't an accident. That was a woman who had been through a war and was still standing. He looked down at his silver watch, the hands ticking forward with a cold, mechanical indifference. He had spent his life managing time, but he had missed the only moments that truly mattered. He felt a wave of nausea. The opulent ballroom with its massive crystal chandeliers and gold leaf moldings, felt like a tomb. He was surrounded by wealth, yet he had never felt more bankrupt. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, the judgment of the high society vultures waiting for a titan to fall. But for the first time in his career, Curtis Montague didn't care about the market or the headlines. He only cared about the woman in the white uniform who was currently disappearing behind a pair of heavy swinging doors, carrying a weight he had helped create. His knees felt weak, a physical manifestation of his internal collapse. He sank back into his velvet chair, not because Rita had asked him to, but because his legs could no longer support the weight of his guilt. He stared at the empty space where Joanna had stood, the marble table now clean but the stain on his conscience growing larger by the second. The CEO was gone. In his place sat a man who had finally realized that the most valuable thing he ever owned was the one thing he had thrown away for free. The heavy swinging doors had barely settled before Joanna reappeared, her movements as rhythmic and ghost-like as a clock's pendulum. She carried a small tray with a fresh white linen and a glass of sparkling water, her head bowed in a posture of perfect agonizing humility. As she reached the table, the air around Curtis seemed to freeze again. He watched her every move with a hunger that was almost violent, his eyes tracing the way her fingers, reddened from hot water and cleaning agents, carefully smoothed the new cloth over the marble. "Joanna, please," Curtis rasped, his hand twitching on the table as if to reach for hers. "Look at me. We need to talk. This environment, the work you're doing, it's not right. Not for you." Joanna didn't flinch. She set the water down with a gentle click, her eyes never rising above the level of his dark navy silk tie. "Is the sparkling water to your satisfaction, sir? Or would the lady prefer a fresh vintage?" Her voice was a masterpiece of emotional erasure. It was flat, toneless, and stripped of the melody that had once sung his name in the quiet hours of the morning. She was using her status as a shield, hiding behind the very uniform that Curtis found so insulting. To her, the CEO was no longer a husband. He was simply a customer at table 12, a source of potential complaints or a tip at the end of a grueling shift. "Stop calling me that," Curtis hissed, the desperation in his voice causing a nearby diner to glance over. "I'm not, sir. I'm Curtis. I'm the man you lived with for 5 years. I'm the man who—" "You are the gentleman who ordered the service, sir," Joanna interrupted, finally lifting her gaze, though her eyes remained as cold and impenetrable as the marble pillars surrounding them. "And I am the help. My personal history ended when I clocked in this evening. If there is nothing else wrong with the table, I have other guests who require my attention." Rita let out a sharp, jagged laugh, her red dress rustling as she leaned forward, her somber expression replaced by a look of sheer triumph. "You heard her, Curtis. She knows her place even if you've forgotten yours. She's a professional. Let her do her job so we can get back to ours." Rita turned her predatory gaze on Joanna, a thin, cruel smile playing on her lips. "Thank you, employee 402. You're dismissed. Try not to trip on your way back to the kitchen. The floor is quite slippery when it's wet." Joanna gave a slight stiff nod. "Thank you, ma'am." As Joanna turned to leave, her body swayed slightly, a brief moment where the weight of her pregnancy and the exhaustion of the night seemed to win. Curtis half rose from his chair, his heart in his throat, but Joanna caught herself on the edge of a chair, her knuckles turning white as she steadied her frame. She didn't look back for help. She didn't look back at him. She simply drew a long, shaky breath and continued her slow, heavy march across the ballroom. Curtis sank back into the velvet seat, feeling a coldness settle into his bones that no amount of expensive brandy could warm. He realized that Joanna's professional mask was the most effective weapon she had ever used against him. By treating him like a stranger, she was forcing him to feel the full weight of the distance he had created 2 years ago. He was surrounded by the old world, decor he had always craved, the gold leaf moldings and the crystal chandeliers, but he felt like a beggar at his own feast. He watched her disappear into the crowd of elite guests, a white spark in a sea of dark suits and colorful gowns. She was the help, invisible to everyone but him, and yet she was the only person in the room who held the power to destroy him. Curtis looked down at his silver watch, the ticking of the seconds sounding like a countdown to a loss he wasn't sure he could survive. The opulent atmosphere of the ballroom, once a symbol of Curtis's triumph, now felt like a suffocating weight. He could no longer focus on Rita's sharp-tongued commentary or the clinking of fine china. His entire world had narrowed to the agonizing rhythm of Joanna's movements. She was working the adjacent table now, her body angled in a way that revealed the true, brutal cost of her labor. From this distance, the hidden details of her struggle became a visceral assault on Curtis's conscience. Under the unforgiving glare of the massive crystal chandeliers, the beads of sweat on Joanna's forehead weren't just shimmering. They were rolling down her face in steady rhythmic tracks, dampening the hair at her temples. Her professional white uniform was no longer crisp. It was beginning to cling to her back, darkened by the heat of a body pushed far beyond its physical limits. Curtis watched, his throat tight, as Joanna reached for a heavy glass pitcher to refill a guest's water. He saw the tremor in her forearm, the way the muscles corded and shook under the weight. Her breath came in short, audible gasps that she tried to mask with a cough or a downward tilt of her head. Every time she leaned over to clear a plate, her hand instinctively went to the small of her back, her fingers pressing into the spine as if trying to hold her crumbling frame together. The contrast was a physical ache in Curtis's chest. He sat there, draped in a navy pinstripe suit that cost more than a year of a server's wages, his hands smooth and rested, while the woman who had once shared his bed was literally vibrating with exhaustion. He saw her eyes flutter for a moment, a brief, terrifying second where her eyelids grew heavy and her knees buckled just an inch, before she forced herself upright again with a sheer act of will that made his own corporate hustle look like child's play. "She's going to faint," Curtis whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He began to stand, his silver watch catching the light as his hands gripped the edge of the table. "Sit down, Curtis," Rita hissed, her voice a low, vibrating warning. She didn't even look at Joanna. Her eyes remained fixed on the ballroom's entrance, scanning for the arrival of the evening's keynote speaker. She's a grown woman making her own choices. If she can't handle the shift, she shouldn't have taken it. It's not your cross to carry. But Curtis wasn't listening. He was watching Joanna's hand. She was holding a cleaning cloth, trying to wipe a stray drop of sauce from a tablecloth, but her fingers wouldn't close properly. They remained stiff, trembling with the kind of fatigue that signaled total systemic failure. A fresh wave of perspiration broke across her upper lip, and for a moment the icy mask of the help cracked. Her eyes closed tight, her face contorting in a silent grimace of pain, perhaps a cramp, perhaps a kick from the life growing inside her, before she bit her lip and forced her features back into a blank servant's stare. The injustice of it was a roar in his ears. This was a woman in the late stages of pregnancy, working in a room filled with billionaires who spent more on a single bottle of wine than it would take to give her a year of rest. And he was the king of those billionaires. He was the one who had taught her, through his coldness, that she couldn't rely on him. He watched a drop of her sweat fall, a single clear pearl that landed on the polished marble floor she was destined to clean. It was a tiny, inconsequential thing to everyone else in the room, but to Curtis it was a mountain of evidence. He realized then that the old-world decor and the gold leaf moldings weren't just decorations, they were the bars of a cage he had built, and Joanna was the one bleeding on the floor to keep it shiny. Rita did not miss the way Curtis's breathing had become shallow, or the way his gaze remained anchored to the pregnant woman moving like a shadow between the tables. She was a woman who dealt in the currency of social standing, and she could feel the value of their evening dropping with every second Curtis remained entranced. She leaned back, the silk of her red dress catching the light of the chandeliers, her expression shifting from irritation to a somber, calculated coldness. She was no longer just annoyed, she was observing a threat. "You're making it very obvious, Curtis," Rita said, her voice a sharp, low-velocity hum that cut through the jazz. She didn't look at him, choosing instead to watch the reflection of the room in her polished wine glass. "People aren't looking at the ice sculptures anymore. They're looking at you. And they're looking at her." Curtis didn't blink. He was watching Joanna struggle to lift a heavy tray of discarded appetizers, her knuckles white against the silver. "She shouldn't be doing that," he muttered, his voice thick with a useless, belated protective instinct. "What she should or shouldn't be doing is the business of the hotel's human resources department, not the CEO of Stone Capital," Rita snapped, finally turning her head to fix him with a predatory stare. "But since you can't seem to look away, look at the others. Look at the Henderson table. Look at the mayor's wife. Curtis finally shifted his gaze, and the reality of their environment hit him like a cold drench of water. The scandal was already beginning to brew. At the neighboring tables, the polite, rehearsed conversations of the elite had taken on a different tone. He saw the way Mrs. Henderson leaned over to whisper into her husband's ear, her eyes darting from Curtis's pinstriped suit to the sweat-stained back of Joanna's uniform. He saw the hushed, nodding heads and the way several guests began to recognize the woman in the white apron. In a world this small and this wealthy, secrets were merely delayed news. Joanna had been the Mrs. Montague for 5 years. She had stood in these same ballrooms in couture gowns, her hand on Curtis's arm. Even with the weight of her pregnancy and the exhaustion of her labor, her features were unmistakable to those who had once clinked glasses with her. The realization was spreading through the room like a slow-acting poison. The billionaire Curtis Montague was sitting in luxury, while his pregnant ex-wife scrubbed the floors at his feet. "They think you're a monster, Curtis," Rita whispered, a cruel, satisfied edge to her voice. She knew that the only thing Curtis feared more than failure was a tarnished reputation. Or they think she's a martyr. Either way, this is a PR disaster that no amount of charitable donations will fix. If you stay here, you're endorsing this scene. If you talk to her again, you're confirming the connection. Rita reached across the table, her hand, manicured and soft, covering his. The contrast between her pristine skin and the image of Joanna's reddened, trembling hands was almost more than Curtis could bear. "We need to leave," Rita urged, her tone shifting to a fake, soft concern that didn't reach her eyes. "Let's go to the penthouse. We can call the manager from the car and have her taken care of." Quietly, away from the cameras, Curtis looked at Rita, and for the first time, he saw the jagged, ugly machinery of the world he had worked so hard to dominate. Rita wasn't worried about Joanna's health or the baby. She was worried about the visual. She wanted to erase Joanna not because of the pain she was in, but because her pain was an inconvenience to the gala's aesthetic of perfection. A murmur rose from a table nearby, followed by a muffled gasp as Joanna swayed dangerously while reaching for a fallen napkin. The socialite sitting there didn't reach out to help. She simply pulled her expensive skirt back, her face twisted in a mask of somber observation, waiting to see if the maid would actually collapse on the marble. The scandal was no longer brewing. It was boiling over. The gold leaf moldings and crystal chandeliers seemed to lean in, amplifying the whispers. Curtis felt the eyes of his peers, those high society vultures, waiting to see how the titan would react. He was trapped between the cold, status-driven safety of Rita's world and the raw, bleeding reality of the woman who had once been his everything. Every second he sat there, he was choosing a side. And the side he was currently on felt like a grave. The breaking point didn't come with a shout or a dramatic gesture. It came with the sickening soft thud of a knee hitting the marble. Joanna had been reaching for a heavy silver tureen at the center of a nearby table when her body finally surrendered. Her legs, which had carried the weight of her pregnancy and the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift, simply gave out. She didn't fall completely, but she buckled, her hand slapping against the cold stone to catch herself, the silver tureen wobbling dangerously as a muffled cry escaped her lips. The ballroom, a place designed for the seamless flow of luxury, seemed to hitch. For a heartbeat, the music and the clinking of glasses felt like a recording being slowed down. No one moved. The elite guests at the table, men in tuxedos and women in diamonds, simply pulled their chairs back a few inches, their faces frozen in a mask of somber, detached observation. They looked at her as if she were a broken piece of furniture that had dared to interrupt their dinner. Curtis felt the air leave his lungs. Seeing her like that, hunched over, her white uniform strained, her face pale and slick with a fresh sheen of cold sweat, shattered the last of his corporate armor. The CEO who valued poise above all else vanished. Joanna! The name ripped from his throat, a raw, jagged sound that cut through the jazz like a gunshot. He stood up so abruptly that his velvet chair toppled backward, the heavy wood striking the floor with a resonance that demanded attention. "Curtis, don't you dare," Rita hissed, her voice a lethal whisper as she grabbed for the sleeve of his pinstriped suit. Her fingers, tipped with perfectly manicured nails, clamped down like a trap. "If you cross that floor, there is no coming back. Think about the board. Think about the press." Curtis didn't even look at her. He ripped his arm away with a violence that made Rita gasp. his silver watch catching the light as he moved. He didn't care about the board. He didn't care about the millions of dollars in stock that would likely fluctuate by morning. He only cared about the woman who was currently struggling to breathe 3 tables away. He broke the social silence of the gala with every heavy stride. His leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the marble as he bypassed a stunned waiter and pushed through a group of socialites who stood in his path. The whispers followed him like a wake, a rising tide of shock and scandal, but he was deaf to them. He reached her just as she was trying to hoist herself up. Her hand was trembling so violently that she couldn't get a grip on the table's edge. Curtis didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees on the hard marble, heedless of his expensive suit, and wrapped his arms around her. The heat radiating off her body was alarming. She was burning with a fever of pure exhaustion. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Joanna, it's me. I've got you." Joanna stiffened at his touch, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment the professional mask was gone, replaced by a look of such profound, naked vulnerability that it broke his heart. She looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw the tears she had been holding back finally spill over, tracing paths through the sweat on her cheeks. You shouldn't be here," she breathed, her voice a ghost of a sound. "Go back to your table, Curtis. They're staring." "Let them stare," Curtis growled, his jaw tightening as he looked up at the circle of high society vultures who were now hovering, their phones beginning to emerge from silk purses and pockets. He didn't see the old world decor or the massive crystal chandeliers anymore. He saw a room full of people who had watched a pregnant woman collapse and done nothing. He shifted his weight, pulling her closer into the protective curve of his body, his hand resting instinctively near the swell of her belly. In that moment the CEO of Stone Capital died, and a man who had finally realized what he had lost was born. The gala was no longer a celebration of his success, it was the site of his deepest confession. The silence that followed Curtis's movement was more deafening than any applause he had ever received. He was still on his knees, his navy pinstripe trousers pressed against the spilled champagne and floor wax, cradling Joanna as if she were the only stable thing in a world that had gone liquid. The elite of the city stood like statues of salt, their faces a gallery of horror, fascination, and judgment. "Curtis, get up this instant." Rita's voice arrived before she did, but soon she was standing over them, a vibrant, angry pillar of red. Her box braids shook with the force of her trembling rage. "You are humiliating yourself. You are humiliating me. Let the hotel staff handle this servant and come back to the table." Curtis ignored her. He didn't even blink. His focus was entirely on Joanna, whose head was lolling back against his shoulder, her breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. "Joanna," he commanded, his voice vibrating with a raw power that had nothing to do with money. "Joanna, look at me." She tried to turn away, her fingers feebly clawing at the marble, still trying to find her cleaning cloth. "I have to finish," she wheezed, her voice a ghost of a sound. "The manager. He'll fire me. I need the shift, sir." "Look at me," Curtis roared, and the sound was so primal that several guests in the front row actually recoiled. Slowly, agonizingly, Joanna's heavy eyelids lifted. Her eyes were glazed with pain and the fog of near fainting, but she finally fixed them on his face. In that gaze, the employee 402 mask shattered completely. The wall she had built out of sirs and ma'ams crumbled, leaving only the woman who had once been the beat of his heart. "How could you do this?" Curtis asked, his voice dropping to a tortured whisper that somehow carried further than his shout. "How could you let it get to this? You vanished. I sent the papers, I sent the money." "You sent a lawyer, Curtis," she interrupted, a spark of the old Joanna flare up lighting her dying eyes. "You sent a check to buy back your freedom, so you wouldn't have to deal with the mess of a wife who wanted more than a boardroom schedule. I didn't want your millions. I wanted you. But you were already gone long before the papers arrived." She gasped, her hand tightening on his forearm, her nails digging into the expensive wool of his suit. A fresh wave of sweat broke across her brow. "And then there was the baby. I knew what you'd say. I knew you'd call it an inconvenience for your career. So I left. I didn't want your charity. I wanted to earn a life for him. For us." The word "us" hit Curtis like a physical blow to the solar plexus. He looked down at the swell of her stomach, his large hand finally coming to rest there, feeling the warmth and the terrifyingly frantic pulse of the life beneath the white uniform. Is he mine? He whispered, the question hanging in the air like a bared nerve. Joanna didn't answer with words. She simply looked at him with a weary, heartbreaking pity that confirmed everything. Mr. Montague. The floor manager, a thin man with a nervous twitch, finally hurried over, flanked by 2 security guards. I am so sorry for this disruption. We will have this woman removed immediately. She clearly isn't fit for the floor. If you lay a finger on her, Curtis said, his voice dropping to a level of cold, lethal quiet that made the manager stop dead in his tracks. I will buy this hotel tonight just so I can fire you before sunrise. She is not a woman. She is my wife. Ex-wife. Rita shrieked, her face contorting. She is the woman who walked out on you. Curtis, look at what you're doing. You're throwing everything away for a maid who couldn't even keep her marriage together. Curtis finally looked up at Rita. He saw the vibrant red dress, the keyhole neckline, and the somber selfish calculation in her eyes. He saw the world he had spent 2 years trying to perfect, and he realized it was a wasteland. She's not a maid, Rita, Curtis said, standing up and lifting Joanna into his arms with an ease that defied his own exhaustion. He held her close, her head tucked under his chin, her white uniform stark against his dark suit. She's the only person in this room who knows the value of hard work. And she's going home. With me. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't look at the cameras or the senator. He simply turned his back on the gala of gold and began the long walk toward the exit, carrying the weight of his past and the hope of his future in a pair of trembling pinstriped arms. The silence that followed Curtis's declaration was brittle. A glass floor shattered beneath the weight of his words. He stood at the center of the ballroom, cradling Joanna against his chest, his jaw set in a line of iron. He didn't look at the whispering crowds or the flashbulbs reflecting in the crystal chandeliers. He only looked ahead, toward the exit, until a flash of vibrant, angry red blocked his path. Rita stood before him, her chest heaving, her box braids trembling with the force of her indignation. The keyhole neckline of her dress pulsed with every ragged breath she took. She looked at Curtis, then at the sweat-stained, exhausted woman in his arms, and her lip curled in a snarl of pure aristocratic disgust. You're serious, she breathed, the words coming out as a jagged hiss. You're actually going to walk out of this gala, in front of the mayor, the board, and every investor we've spent months courting for this? For a woman who serves champagne and scrubs floors. She isn't this, Rita, Curtis said, his voice flat and dangerous, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through Joanna's tired frame. She is the mother of my child. And she is done serving people like you. Rita's laugh was a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the gold leaf moldings. She stepped closer, her perfume, cloying and expensive, clashing with the metallic scent of Joanna's sweat. People like me? Curtis, I am you. I am the image you spent 2 years crafting. I am the partner who doesn't come with messes or disappearances. I am the woman who fits in your penthouse. She leaned in, her eyes narrowing into predatory slits, delivering her ultimatum with the cold precision of a contract execution. If you walk through those doors with her, don't bother coming back to the office tomorrow. I'll call the board before you even reach the parking valet. I will tell them you've had a mental collapse. I will strip you of the chairmanship before the markets open. You'll have your wife, Curtis, but you'll be as poor as she is by noon. Curtis looked at the woman who had shared his bed and his ambitions for the last year. He saw the cold calculation, the lack of a single shred of empathy for the woman nearly fainting in his arms. He realized then that Rita was exactly what he had asked for when he decided to become a man of stone. She was the mirror of his own worst impulses. Then call them, Curtis said. The weight of Joanna in his arms felt more substantial, more real, than the billions of dollars Rita was threatening to take away. He felt a small, weak hand clutch at his shirt, Joanna's fingers trembling but holding on, and it gave him a surge of clarity that made the gala's opulence look like cheap tinsel. Call every one of them, Curtis continued, his voice rising so the surrounding guests could hear. Tell them I've finally found something worth more than their stock options. Tell them I'm busy being a father. Rita's face contorted, the mask of the somber socialite slipping to reveal a vacuum of pure, narcissistic rage. She raised her hand as if to strike him, but she stopped, paralyzed by the absolute indifference in his eyes. She was a woman who lived for the gaze of others, and in that moment, the most powerful man in the room had stopped seeing her entirely. "You're a fool, Curtis Montague," she spat, her voice cracking with the humiliation of being cast aside for a servant. "You'll realize it when the money runs out and you're stuck in some cramped apartment with a screaming brat and a wife who reminds you of your failure every single day. Don't look for me when you realize the ghost was better than the reality." She turned on her heel, her red dress swirling like a dying flame. She didn't walk. She stormed, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm against the marble as she headed for the main entrance, pushing past the manager and the security guards. She left a vacuum of silence in her wake, a red blur disappearing into the night, leaving Curtis standing alone in the center of his crumbling empire. He didn't watch her go. He adjusted his grip on Joanna, feeling her heart beating against his own, and began his own march. He wasn't walking toward a boardroom or a penthouse anymore. He was walking toward a life he had nearly lost, and for the first time in 2 years, the CEO of Stone Capital knew exactly where he was going. The heavy silence that followed Rita's exit was not a peaceful one. It was the sound of a vacuum being filled by the judgment of the city's most powerful people. Curtis didn't immediately leave. Instead, he carried Joanna back to the table near the marble pillars, the very place where the evening had begun to unravel. He sat down, not as the king of the gala, but as a man seeking a moment of breath in a world that had become unfamiliar. He kept Joanna in his lap, her head resting against the pinstriped wool of his shoulder, her breathing slowly stabilizing as the cool air of the ballroom hit her sweat-dampened skin. He looked around the room and for the first time he saw the gilded room for what it truly was. The gold leaf moldings didn't look like luxury anymore. They looked like the bars of a cage. The massive crystal chandeliers which had earlier seemed to shower the room in light, now cast jagged, distorted shadows that made the elite guests look like ghosts in expensive costumes. He saw the senator leaning in to whisper to a lobbyist, their eyes darting toward him with a mixture of pity and predatory interest. He saw the business owners he had called friends already checking their phones, likely watching the first ripples of his downfall on social media. This was the victory he had traded Joanna for. He had won the corner office, the silver luxury watch, and the fear of his competitors, but as he sat there, he realized he was the poorest man in the building. Every billion-dollar deal he had closed in the last 2 years felt like a handful of dust. He had built a monument to himself, but he had forgotten to build a home. He looked down at Joanna. Her eyes were closed, her long lashes casting shadows on her pale, exhausted face. A single bead of sweat remained on her temple, a reminder of the hours she had spent laboring for people who wouldn't even offer her a glass of water when she stumbled. He felt a surge of such profound regret that it physically ached in his throat. He had allowed the woman who had loved him when he was nothing to become employee 402. He had allowed the mother of his child to scrub marble floors while he sipped vintage champagne 10 feet away. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the crown of her hair, the words feeling too small for the magnitude of his failure. "Joanna, I am so sorry." She stirred slightly, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "The money." "Curtis," she breathed, her voice barely a thread of sound. "You heard what she said. You'll lose it all." Curtis looked at the silver watch on his wrist, the ticking of its hands sounding like a heartbeat in the void. With a slow, deliberate motion, he unbuckled the strap and set the watch face down on the wine-stained table. He left it there next to a half-empty glass of sparkling water. It was a $1 million object that now meant absolutely nothing to him. "Let them take it," he said, and for the first time in 2 years, the tightness in his chest vanished. "I've spent too much time counting what I have and not enough time seeing what I was missing. If the price of having you back is losing this room, then it's the best deal I've ever made." He looked at the high society vultures one last time. They were waiting for him to apologize, to make a statement, to try and save his reputation. But Curtis Montague had nothing left to say to them. He stood up, hoisting Joanna into his arms with a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't look back at the table, the watch, or the hollow victory of his wealth. He walked toward the exit, his shadow long and dark against the gold leaf walls, leaving behind the billionaire he used to be to find the father he was meant to become. The transition from the ballroom to the service corridor was like stepping through a portal between two different universes. Curtis pushed through the heavy double-swing doors, the silver-plated handles cold against his palms. Behind him, the muffled sounds of soft jazz and the high-pitched tinkle of crystal faded, replaced instantly by the harsh industrial reality of the service world. The air here was hot, thick with the smell of floor wax, industrial-grade detergent, and the humid steam of 1,000 washing dishes. Gone were the gold leaf moldings and the soft glow of chandeliers. In their place were flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed with a low-frequency hum, casting a sterile greenish tint over everything. The walls were plain, scarred by the wheels of heavy carts, and the floor was no longer polished marble but slip-resistant gray tile. Curtis felt the jarring shift in his soul. He was no longer the guest of honor, but an intruder in a world that Joanna had been forced to call her own. He carried her past rows of industrial stainless steel sinks where steam billowed into the air. Workers in stained aprons paused, their eyes widening as they watched a man in a navy pinstripe suit, his white shirt dampened by the sweat of the woman in his arms, stride through their sanctuary. Curtis didn't care about the stairs or the grease that threatened to ruin his leather shoes. He felt Joanna's weight, the weight of his child, and the fragility of her breathing, and it drove him forward with a singular, desperate focus. "The locker room," Joanna whispered against his chest, her voice gaining a tiny spark of strength as she realized where they were. I have to clock out, Curtis. My things. My coat is back there." "You're never clocking back in here again," Curtis growled, but he followed her weak gesture toward a narrow hallway lined with dented metal lockers. The service world was a labyrinth of hard edges and hidden exhaustion. He saw a young server slumped on a plastic crate, head in her hands, taking a 5-minute reprieve from the gala's demands. He saw the frantic energy of the kitchen staff, their faces flushed from the heat of the ovens, working like cogs in a machine designed to feed the very people who had watched Joanna collapse and done nothing. This was the reality Curtis had ignored while he sat at the head of boardrooms, the invisible labor that held his perfect world aloft. He reached the staff break room, a cramped space with a single vending machine and a bulletin board covered in shift schedules. He gently lowered Joanna onto a worn wooden bench, keeping his arm behind her back to support her. The physical contrast was staggering. Her white uniform, grayed at the edges from a long night of labor, against the pristine wool of his designer trousers. Joanna leaned her head back against the locker, her eyes searching his. The fluorescent light was unforgiving, highlighting the shadows under her eyes and the pale, translucent quality of her skin. "Why did you come after me, Curtis? You heard Rita. You're losing everything. Your office, your name, the life you love." Curtis reached out, his hand trembling as he tucked a damp strand of hair behind her ear. He looked at her, not as a billionaire looking at a waitress, but as a man looking at his salvation. "I didn't love that life, Joanna. I was just hiding in it," he said, his voice echoing in the small, quiet room. "I spent 2 years building a kingdom of glass, and it took seeing you on that floor to realize I was the one who was empty. If I lose the office, I'll find another. If I lose the money, I'll earn more. But I'm not losing you again. And I'm certainly not losing our child." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, the salt of her sweat tasting like the truth. For the first time in 730 days, the CEO was gone, and the man Joanna had once fallen in love with stood in his place. "Let's go home," he whispered. He helped her stand, his arm firmly around her waist, and they walked toward the heavy service exit. As the door clicked shut behind them, the hum of the gala was finally silenced, replaced by the cool, quiet air of the night and the promise of a morning that belonged to them alone.